Today we're going to look at something for the 32X. Now, unlike the Sega CD that came out in 1991, the Sega 32X didn't really bring anything new to the table in 1995. At best, it was a minimal upgrade of the Sega Genesis's hardware. However, that doesn't mean that the stuff that came out for it was complete junk. In fact, it did some stuff that the Sega Genesis couldn't have done without it. And two of those games as a kid that really meant a lot to me were these bad boys: Space Harrier and Afterburner, part of the Arcade Classic series, which included such hits as Space Harrier and Afterburner. And that's as far as they got before the system tanked. That kind of sucks. But that doesn't mean that these aren't worth talking about, because realistically, when they came out, they kind of changed my opinion about a lot of things. And I'm going to tell you exactly why.
Let's start off talking about why this was important. See, up until 1990, the closest ports we had were the ones for the Sega Master System. These ports, while impressive for the hardware and the time, were shadows of the games we played in the arcades. While we waited for those wonderful 16-bit versions, we would end up disappointed, as Space Harrier never saw a release in the Genesis, though its sequel Space Harrier 2 did, though it was a very different game and not the same game that we fell in love with. On the other hand, Afterburner 2 did see a release on the Genesis in 1990. This is worth mentioning because Afterburner 2 was actually more of an upgrade to 1, a minor revision, as opposed to an actual sequel, but still seen as an inferior port of the arcade version. However, it wouldn't be until 1994 until Space Harrier returned, and it wouldn't be until 1995 until Afterburner would have another shot at an arcade-perfect port. Space Harrier is one of the most famous and unique Sega games before the time of the Sega Genesis and Sonic the Hedgehog. Unlike most shooters that had a top-down or side-scrolling perspective, this game had your character's back towards you, and you would have projectiles from enemies coming in closer and closer to view, giving it a third-person, over-the-shoulder feel. The game achieved this using pseudo 3D backgrounds, and then mixing in the 2D sprites of your character and the enemies fighting against you. The world you fought in was the Fantasy Zone, which, by allowing a no-rules land of make-believe, allowed for a surreal set of enemies, like prehistoric, cyclops mammoths, dragons, alien pods, mushrooms, and a whole bunch of things out of your mind that you never knew. The game was also frantic, throwing more and more enemies and objects at you through each level in more chaotic situations, always keeping you in danger and on high guard as you fought your way to the end. Today, the game is still a colorful, enjoyable little chunk of arcade bliss that tests your reflexes to their very core and keeps things just fresh enough to look at and new obstacles to adapt to make the game worth booting up again. Of course, the big deal was it being such an accurate port of an arcade game, something rarely seen at the time. Here, with a side-by-side, you can see pretty much right in line with how you would have played it in the game. It was insane having something that close to an arcade game at the time. Now, though, there are many options you have to play this great game besides the 32X version. You can play it on either Shenmue for the Dreamcast or Shenmue 2 for the Xbox in an arcade in the town. The reason for this mainly being that Yu Suzuki, the creator of Shenmue, also made Space Harrier. The arcade port is also unlockable on the Sonic Ultimate Genesis Collection for the 360 and the PS3. It's also a downloadable title on the Wii Virtual Console, and will soon be available on the 3DS as Space Harrier 3D, with the obvious 3D mode as well as widescreen support. Finally, in 1996, a disc for the Sega Saturn called Sega Ages, a series in Japan of re-released Sega games, sometimes updated with new graphics and modes, was released with an excellent port of Space Harrier considered to be the best to date, as well as Outrun and Afterburner 2. Speaking of... Afterburner was another Yu Suzuki game. The game was a bit more basic, and it was an arcade-style combat flight simulator. This meant it wasn't super realistic. It was just a machine gun, some missiles, and a whole lot of rolling. Of course, besides being just a fun, well-made, and good-looking game, what set it apart in arcades back in 1987 was the sit-down cabinet, in which the machine allowed for tilt, which immersed you that much more as you took to the skies as your seats rocked back and forth, up and down, made you feel like you were really in the cockpit of the plane. Now this is where things get a bit weird. In 1988, Afterburner 2 was released. Afterburner 2 was really just a minor revision of the first game. It added 3 new stages, allowed for control of the speed of your plane, and it allowed for quicker missile firing. The Genesis port was released in 1990, and while being considered to be a good port, was still not up to snuff with the arcade version at the time. The machine gun was on auto-fire due to the limitations of the 3-button controller, and the pace wasn't as quick and the backgrounds lost much of their detail, the last two due to hardware limitations. Also, in the arcades, your plane snapped back into center position on the horizontal plane, keeping it level. It didn't do this in the Genesis version due to a regular controller as opposed to a joystick, which made it a little more difficult to aim and control. So, in 1995, Afterburner was ported to the 32X as Afterburner Complete, but it was basically just a port of Afterburner 2. The game was great, but with its only major flaw being that it ran at 30 frames per second, as opposed to the arcade's 60 frames per second, which made it a little more choppy and a little more slow than the arcade counterpart. Unlike Space Harrier, however, I found Afterburner to not hold up as well. The game doesn't have the interesting visuals and different types of enemies to keep things as interesting. The levels all sort of blend together as well. The only real changes is between land and water and day and night. And there's no real bosses per se. The levels just kind of keep going. Eventually the level ends, the setting changes, and you start fighting more enemy jets. Also, the game does tend to be a bit on the difficult side, but not in the I lost because I didn't dodge something fast enough and I died of my own faults. But in the there are so many damn missiles on screen right now, it is hard for me to dodge them all at once and still not hit one, and then you've got all these extra planes coming at you that are firing the missiles and you gotta dodge them at the same time, and it's all just really hard not to end up hitting something. And it really makes things worse because the visuals in that game sort of blend together and it's easy not to be able to tell things apart, whereas Space Harrier's more unique and colorful visuals make it a little more pronounced. They both have a fast pace to them, but I feel it's a little bit easier with Space Harrier just because everything's so pronounced and different and unique, and they all don't just blend together in the backgrounds. Although, again, the games aren't perfect apples-to-apples comparisons, they are sort of going for different things. Ignoring the actual preference of which games hold up, back in 95 terms, this was a pretty damn good port of a pretty classic game, and it was really cool to finally be able to play this at home with a version that ran almost as good as the arcade version did. This game, compared to Space Harrier, does not have the same availability these days. Again, in 1996, this came out for the Saturn in the Sega Ages collection with Space Harrier and Outrun, and all 3 versions are considered to be some of the best versions of these games released to this date. It was also ported in Shenmue 2, but not in Shenmue 1. However, the port in Shenmue 2 isn't perfect, with some blurry, upscaled graphics, and it lacks the options of the dedicated releases being just a straight-up arcade port. And that was it. Afterburner was never put on any Sega Genesis collections, not even in the form of the Sega Genesis version of Afterburner 2, nor did it see any re-releases on stuff like the Virtual Console.
So as you can see, maybe Afterburner and Space Harrier weren't the biggest things to come out of the 32X. Yes, there were some bigger exclusives and some really bad exclusives that people really remember. But they kind of forget about these two because all they were arcade ports. But they were such accurate arcade ports that made it really cool. Yes, it would only take about a year until the Sega Saturn would come out with the definitive arcade ports of these two games. But I never got a Sega Saturn. I ended up going to the N64 at that point. So for me, this was the coolest thing in the world until, I became older and actually had the ability to research on the internet. But even then, this is one of those things that reminds me of why maybe the 32X gets a little more shit than it really deserves. Yes, it was a dumb idea. Yes, it really didn't bring a lot of new spec and hardware to the system. And yes, it was a stupid idea with a Saturn coming out 6 months in the future. But for me, I was playing arcade games in the home that were pretty much the exact same as what I played when I went to an arcade. And that was a really cool thing. So until next time.